Welcome to Equine Guelph's Research Radio, a monthly look at the cutting edge research being conducted at Equine Guelph, brought to you by SSG Gloves. Our guest today is Dr. Kristen McCarthy, who specializes in injury research. Dr. McCarthy shares her work on assessing the effects of impact loading on performance horses. More in a moment, but first, SSG is on the cutting edge of premier gloves. The original SSG all-weather glove is our most popular. Quality, durability, fit, and comfort perfect for any equine discipline with its AquaSuede Plus palm and elasticized back for cool, comfortable fit. All you have to do is throw it in the wash and let it air dry. The original, the SSG all-weather glove. See your SSG dealer for details. Dr. McCarthy, welcome to Research Radio.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
For those of us that don't have our veterinary degree yet, perhaps you can explain what exactly impact loading is.
Impact loading is a type of loading that we would see that occurs with really high accelerations and low forces. So essentially meaning that it's when the hoof initially strikes the ground, that we're really only looking at the really small mass associated with that. So the lower part of the leg, just basically from the knee down. So really not high, which is, we all know that force equals mass times acceleration. So the mass portion of that is really quite small, but the accelerations that we read are very high. Okay. So if we were to think of accelerations in the form of G forces, for example, the rate at which the accelerations at which we stand on Earth are 1G. Mm-hmm. But in relation to what we measure on the racehorses, specifically standard-bred racehorses, we are upwards of 400 to 600 Gs.
That's a phenomenal amount, isn't it?
Very high, extremely high.
What are the factors that contribute to high force loading?
So when we look at high force, so obviously, again, like I said, force equals mass times acceleration. And so when we look at this high force loading, again, right, it's that two component of both the mass and the acceleration. And so when we compare that to, say, a mid-stance load, mid-stance is when the actual, there's almost no acceleration, the horse's body weight is completely loading on the limb. That's really high mass loading, upwards of 2.5 times the horse's body weight. And if we consider that most horses are in or around the 1,000 to 1,500 pound range, that we're really looking at a lot of mass at that point in time with almost little to no accelerations, and then versus compare that to our high impact loading, right, where I said we have this very small mass, maybe 10 to 15 kilos, mm-hmm. with the really high accelerations associated with that. So really we end up getting this high force loading in both scenarios, but typically the research has really been focused on the mid-stance, this high mass loading versus this high impact loading.
Okay, because I wanted to ask, how does impact loading compare to mid-stance loading?
Yeah, I mean, and so that's really was the goal of some of this research, and what we're looking at is how do they compare? Impact is very difficult to measure because it happens so quickly. The time point that we're actually looking to measure is anywhere from 3 to 5 milliseconds. So just a moment in time, which obviously can become very difficult to simulate in an ex vivo setting, so outside of the normal animal, right? If we were to do cadaver studies or these types of studies, it becomes much more difficult versus the static controlled loading.
Mm-hmm. Now, how might impact loading relate to injury in the, say, the MCP joint of performance horses?
So initially, what we're interested in looking at, we know that there's a relationship when we get this high impact loading that it causes micro damage. So really, we're looking at a fine level and sort of looking at the cumulative nature over time. So we know that it's healthy for us to load, say you or I were walking around, it's healthy for us to load our bones because it gives us that mechanical stimulation to keep the bone strong, to tell it we need to be strong in this type of loading in order to resist failure, right? So we don't just step and break our bones. But when you exceed that, I think it's a combination, and this is just a hypothesis because we're still looking into this further, but when we sort of exceed that threshold where you get like this cumulative effect of loading that sort of takes it beyond, where we're getting this cumulative damage, that's maybe potentially where we're seeing the problems. And you think of, like, especially I talk about performance horses, is because really they're extreme athletes in some ways, and we ask them to do very fast, hard work at a very young age.
Yeah. So here's the question. Horses aren't cars. I wish they were some days, and you could just put in better shock absorbers or whatever to minimize the impact of loading. But how can we minimize the effect of impact loading in racehorses?
Well, part of this research is in conjunction with, we're looking at some of the surfaces on which horses train and race on, or perform on even. In particular, the one that we found the highest accelerations is really no surprise that we're seeing it on the hardest surfaces. So for the standard breds, they run on, essentially, it's a crushed gravel track. So
right.
Understandably, the cart runs well on that. However, when the horses are loading on that type of a surface, impact loading, that we're obviously getting these very high readings. So sort of finding that balance where it is that we can minimize that impact effect a bit with still producing the same results. It's a real challenge. And I think a lot of it is when the horses, we typically will put a lot of our efforts into the racing surfaces, but the training surfaces on which they spend most of their time are sometimes completely ignored.
And that's a problem financially, obviously, given the state of the industry these days, to come up with the science to create the kind of track that would have more cushion to it, I guess is what it comes down to.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and it's not that's only one small portion of their stride. There's other factors we have to think of. What if we help out impact, are we causing problems further down the road? So we're looking at it in a very small subset right now, but really the problem needs to be looked at more as a whole.
Would shoeing come into the picture in terms of minimizing impact?
So essentially, when we have a horse that is barefoot, it allows their hoof to flare slightly as they're upon impact, and then as they're mid-stance loading. So it's almost like this natural built-in cushion device. So when we shoe, we are typically we're shoeing for extra traction, maybe to correct a gait abnormality, but in essence, we sort of restrict that natural flare of the foot.
I see. So shoeing isn't the answer then?
It's not. Again, it's a small portion of. But if we take away the reduced traction, then horses may be further susceptible to injury because they're slipping or they're sliding on the base of the track.
It's a catch-22.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with the study. Continued success.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you, Doctor.
That's great. Thank you so much.